You may have been taught and have always understood that the abomination of desolation event that Jesus spoke of begins in the exact middle of the final 7 years, also known as Daniel's 70th week. But does it really begin in the exact middle? We are going to look at some scriptural evidence that shows that perhaps the exact middle was never the intended way we were supposed to understand this. Hey everyone, John Wertsema here, and today we're going to be discussing a very important verse. In fact, it's probably the most scrutinized verse in the entire Bible when it comes to the area of Bible prophecy, and it's Daniel 9, verse 27. And it has to do with the prophecy about the abomination of desolation and when it begins. But for those of you who this might be your first time here on, visiting my channel, what we're doing in this series called Settling the Rapture Debate is going through my book called Settling the Rapture Debate, chapter by chapter, and we're giving kind of like a summary or introductory summary of each chapter and what it's about. Now, there are 40 chapters, and we're currently on chapter 4, which is called Not the Exact Middle. Okay, so, and again, this is in reference to, Daniel 9, verse 27, where it says, but in the middle of that week or in the middle of that 7 years. And so the question is this talking about the exact middle, or is this talking about something else? And we're going to look at that verse in a minute. But in previous videos, we've discussed this particular prophecy of the 70 weeks of Daniel. And we showed that the 70th week is a 7-year period of time that happens at the end of the age. And again, I like bringing this to the forefront that Galatians 1:4 calls the current time, from the time of Adam all the way up until the return of Christ, the present evil age, right? That's because Satan is currently in control of the spiritual realm over the earthly realm. And, Paul calls him the God of this age. Okay, so at the end of this present evil age, there will be a 7-year period of time that's marked out, and we get that from the prophecy of the 70 weeks of Daniel in chapter 9 of Daniel. So we've discussed how within the book of Revelation, there are 5 mentions of 3.5-year periods of time, and those 3.5-year periods actually confirm a 7-year framework, because 2 of the mentions are talking about the first 3.5 years, and 3 of the mentions are talking about the second 3.5 years. And when you put them together, you have a 7-year period. And what this does is it shines a spotlight on the midpoint of the 7 years, saying, hey, something major is happening here at midpoint. And so some of those events, as we get into future videos, we're going to be discussing some of these major events. But these are the events that happen at midpoint. At the exact midpoint is number 1 is the war in heaven. Number 2 is the 6th seal. Number 3 is the 7th trumpet. Number 4 is the judgment of the great harlot. And we also have the birth of the male child. And there are other events, those are just some, that happen at midpoint of the 7 years. But today we're discussing another event, and that is the abomination of desolation. And why this is important is because many people assume that the abomination of desolation event happens exactly at midpoint. And I'm going to show you today the reason why I don't believe it actually begins at midpoint. I believe that the abomination of desolation has everything to do with the Great Tribulation, the time of distress, but the point in time when it begins, I believe the Bible lays out. And we're going to start looking at this right here in Daniel chapter 9. And this verse right here, we could classify this into 3 sections. The first section would be, he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. We'll talk about the covenant, and we'll talk about who he confirms, who the he is, and who he confirms the covenant with. We'll talk about that in another video. The second section, which we're discussing today, is in the middle of that week, he will bring sacrifices and offerings to a halt. Now, the first part of this section, the second section here, we're going to look at, but in the middle of that week, okay, the second part of this section we're not going to look at, which is he will bring sacrifices and offerings to a halt. We're going to discuss that in another video as well. But then it goes on to say in the third section of this verse, on the wing of abominations will come one who destroys, until the decreed end is poured out on the one who destroys. This is the third section right here. And this one here, if you look at it in another translation, like the King James, it'll say the phrase abomination of desolation. And that's where, we get from Matthew 24 when Jesus says, for when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. And he was actually referencing and pointing back to not only this verse, but also Daniel chapter 12, verse 11, which we're going to look at in just a moment. Okay, so the question on deck right now is, but in the middle of that week, is this talking about in the middle of that 7-year period, in the exact middle? Or could this possibly be an approximate middle? Does it have to be in the exact middle? That's the question. And in order to get the answer to that question, we're going to look at the word middle in the Hebrew. The word middle here, you see it's highlighted, it's the word katsi, and actually does mean half or middle. But I'm going to show you that in the Hebrew text, we go back and we could look at every instance that this word shows up in the Hebrew Bible. And it's good to do this sometimes and do word studies. But I'm going to show you something very interesting on just a few verses of how this word is used in other places. And that will help us to determine how we should perceive this word is being used in the verse we're looking at right here. Okay, so the first verse we're going to look at is in Exodus chapter 26 and verse 16. And it says, 10 cubits shall be the length of each board, and 1.5 cubits the width of each board. The word half here is, again, it's katsi. And in this passage, it's dealing with measurement. So we're going to look at another verse, but there are many verses that you could look at, especially when they were talking about the construction of different things in the Old Testament. When measurement was being used, the word katsi was used many times in reference to measurement as being a half in a very precise manner, because measurements need to be precise, right? Okay, so the next verse we're going to look at is in 1 Kings, and it's chapter 7, verse 31. It says, its opening inside the crown at the top was a cubit, and its opening was round like the design of a pedestal. A cubit and a half, and also on its opening there were engravings. Okay, so a cubit and a half. Again, here the word katsi shows up in a precise way when dealing with measurement. And again, you can do this on your own. You can study this on your own and look up every instance in the Old Testament when the word katsi was used in relation to measurement. And of course, it's going to be talking about a precise thing. It's a precise measurement. Now let's look at another verse that's not talking about measurement. That's talking about time, right? In Judges chapter 16, verse 3, it says, Samson spent half the night with the prostitute. Then he got up in the middle of the night and left. So here in this verse, the Hebrew word katsi shows up twice. The first time it says he spent half the night, katsi, half the night. The second time it says he got up in the middle, or katsi, in the katsi of the night, in the middle of the night. So you can see how when it's talking about measurement, it has to be used in a precise way. But when it's talking about time, this isn't talking about in the exact middle of the night. It's talking in an approximate sense. Another verse that even gives a better description of this is Psalm 102, verse 24, where the psalmist says, I say, O my God, do not take me away in the midst of my days. In the middle, that word right there, it's katsi, it's the same word. So are we to believe that the psalmist knew that he was going to live to be X amount of years long, and that he knew that he was exactly in the middle, the exact middle of his lifespan? Of course not. When we go back to Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, we have to make a choice about this word katsi, in the middle of that week. And I would say that there's a precedent for the word katsi to be used when dealing with measurement, to be used in a precise way. But there isn't a precedent in Scripture where the word katsi was used in dealing with a time period in a precise way. So this one here is in the middle of that 7 years. The 7 years is a time period. So the Bible opens up the idea, the possibility, okay, with this word katsi, as the possibility exists, in other words, that this isn't talking about the exact middle of the 7 years. Okay, so the question is why does everybody automatically assume that this is talking about the exact middle? That's the question. And I think it needs to be asked, because I don't really believe that this is talking about the exact middle. This is talking about the approximate middle. And there's another verse that we're going to look at here, Daniel chapter 12, verse 11. Again, we're talking about the timing of when the abomination of desolation begins, right? And this verse also talks about the abomination of desolation. So it says, from the time that the daily sacrifice is removed. Now, this is just a little bit different wording, but it's talking about the same exact thing. Over in Daniel 9:27, it says, he shall cause the sacrifice and offering to halt. Here it says, from that time the daily sacrifice is removed. Just a little bit different wording, talking about the exact same thing. And then it says, and the abomination that causes desolation set in place. So here we have, this is the abomination of desolation. This is the one Jesus was referring to when he said, when you see the abomination of desolation, these are the two verses that he was referencing. But this verse gives us kind of a new perspective, an element here that we need to pay very close attention to, because it says, from the time that the daily sacrifice is removed and the abomination that causes desolation set in place, there are 1,290 days. Okay, this should be a big red flag, all right? Because why? Because we've already discussed how the Bible uses we go over into the book of Revelation, and we see the time frame of 1,260 days used a couple of times, okay, in reference to a 3.5-year period, right? So we know a 3.5-year period is 1,260 days, without a doubt. But here, in this verse, we have a 1,290-day period, and from what this verse is saying, it's saying that from the time when the abomination of desolation begins, there's going to be 1,290 days left. Okay, so what do we do with the extra 30 days? And this is a big question, and it's debatable. There are different ideas. People have different ideas of what to do with these extra 30 days. But when we look at it, we have to deal with, because there's no error in the original manuscript. There's no error in the, translations here. This actually does say 1,290 days, right? So God intended for us to understand this 1,290 days, and that this is an important number, and that when we're doing our calculations, I mean, he gave us these numbers so we could do calculations, so we could understand all these prophecies and where to place the events within the 7 years. And so this 1,290-day number, it's a very important part of what we're trying to do. So the question is where do you put the extra 30 days? Now, what some interpreters will do is take the extra 30 days and tack them on to the end of the 7 years. So it'll be 7 years plus 30 days. All right, there's another number after this where it says, blessed is the one who waits and attains for the 1,335 days. We're not going to talk about that one today. We're just dealing with the 1,290 days. All right, where do we put the extra 30 days? So a lot of times people will say, well, let's put them on to the end of the 7 years. That stretches it out an extra 30 days. I would say that that isn't the correct way to do that, because when it says from the time that the daily sacrifice is removed and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there are 1,290 days, and the assumption that it appears to me that's being made is it's 1,290 days until the end of the 7 years. So just speaking logically, if you start with the end of the 7 years and you back up 1,290 days, where do you come to? You come to 30 days before the exact middle, because the last half of the 7 years is 1,260 days long. Okay, so I believe that this verse is giving indication that the abomination of desolation event begins 30 days before the exact middle. Now, when you calculate this out, that only comes to 2.3% off of the exact middle. So, yes, it's an approximate, but again, we just looked at in Daniel 9:27 that the word katsi, in dealing with time periods, it's usually in an approximate sense. And so the Bible gives the possibility, automatically gives the possibility that this is talking about the approximate middle. So I would say is, why would you try to defend an exact middle for the starting point of the abomination of desolation when the Bible allows for the possibility, by the word it used, katsi, for the possibility to not be the exact middle? Okay, so if this is correct, and you start at the end of the 7 years and you back up 1,290 days, that means that from the time that the daily sacrifice is removed and the abomination that causes desolation is set in place, and I don't like that translation. Another translation is the abomination of desolation is permitted. That's probably a better translation of the Hebrew word there, but we'll talk about that again in another video. From that point, from the time of the abomination of desolation, there shall be 1,290 days until the end of the 7 years. Okay, so this is the structure that we use when we're talking about the midweek rapture position. All right, so what this does then, and we're going to start in the next videos talking about the Great Tribulation, because the abomination of desolation event, it triggers the beginning. It's the starting point of the time of the Great Tribulation. The question that we're going to answer in all of this is, well, what is the abomination of desolation? How long does it last? When does it end? What causes it to end? Certainly it's tied to the idea, the abomination of desolation is tied to the time of distress that's talked about in Daniel 12 verse 1, and it's dealing with the time of great tribulation, which they're all the same thing. The question is how long does that period of time last, right? So you've got some views that would say, the great tribulation and the time of the abomination of desolation and all this lasts for the entire last 3.5 years. Okay, but that's because they automatically just assume that the abomination of desolation begins at midpoint. And I'm saying that I believe the scriptures are saying that the abomination of desolation starts 30 days before midpoint. So now from here, we have to follow through with this way of thinking and place the events of the book of Revelation onto the 7 years with this way of thinking in mind and actually go through the process. We need to understand what the scriptures are saying and pull that information out and then work through it. And so this right here, this time frame that we're giving you, about 30 days before the exact middle, is just the beginning of that process. And we're going to continue to lay down events of the book of Revelation on top of our 7-year time frame with this in mind.